It's June 25th, 2019. I'm Harley Sims, and this is the Atlas of Elsewhere. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about escapism. This being a podcast about fantasy and fiction, I thought it was an important thing to address. I've written on my blog about it here and there, but I don't really think there's a limit to how much we can talk about escapism and what it means, especially for those who are pretty unrepentant about their imaginative pursuits. So, first off, what is escapism? Is it something therapeutic? Is it an opiate? Is it a waste of time? Is it irresponsible? Is it bad for you? Is it good for you? Why do we do it either way? Avoiding any overly specialized definitions, I think we can all agree that escapism is about getting away from reality. There's both a push and a pull to the escape. What you're escaping from, what you're escaping to. But I think the emphasis of escapism is more often on what you're escaping from, your jail, rather than what you're trying to get into. You're trying to get away from something, I think, with escapism. I think fantasy is more often the word used to describe what we're getting into, whereas escapism is used to describe, or at least imply, what we're getting away from. So if escapism is about getting away from reality, what kinds of reality are we talking about? Is it a boring job? Is it an unfulfilling relationship? Bills, aging, broken dreams? In this case, isn't a desire to escape an indictment of your own life? Does escapism occur to everyone? Is the perfect life something that you never want to escape from? In the same way, painlessness demands no painkillers. I don't know if it's all that serious. Escapism can be an indulgence rather than a lifestyle. But even putting it that way, it makes it sound like a sin. And there's the derogatory side of it again, which I don't think we can really avoid. And we can talk about that more later. So where do we go? Well, I'll be honest. When I first told my wife I was doing this episode on escapism, she told me to keep it simple. She said, you could talk about escapism for weeks. That's not just because of my interests. It's also because a lot of the work I did for my doctorate was about how we engage with fiction, how we get into it and kind of leave the real world behind. So I'll start with a personal reflection. It's probably no surprise to anybody that I used to play Dungeons and Dragons. Not a ton. Mostly with family and especially with my cousin who's no longer with us. I have played in a couple of tournaments, which I suppose sets me apart, especially since I won both of them. Yes, I have Dungeons & Dragons trophies in my office. Though, to be honest, the dice were just really lucky that day, and I kind of wish I'd been in a casino instead, because I'd have come home with a lot more than a D&D trophy. What I did do a lot more than play D&D, though, is think about D&D. Its worlds, its possibilities, its variety, and its open-endedness. The idea that you can progress infinitely. Among the fans and consumers of RPG material are a rarely recognized group of people who don't play so much as use the publications as travel guides and inspiration. You can spend hours going through a monster manual, or the spell section of a player's handbook, or the equipment. In the same way you could admire catalogs, even encyclopedias of trees, of cars, or even Corel. I suppose it's different when you're admiring things that don't really exist, but let's face it, if you're into cars, how many Koenigseggs are you really going to see in life anyway? You're basically looking at a unicorn. Being immersed in imagination gave me a vantage on the world that I'm sure by some measures was escapist. It's not in the classic way, though. I wasn't like some suburban kid who escaped from tract housing into swords and sorcery. Being from British Columbia, I lived in a wondrous natural world with a climate ranging from deserts to rainforests and mountains and grasslands. I lived on a lake. I went hunting. I went off into the woods with my dog. Everything I did in that environment was enriched by my imagination, almost like a special set of goggles, like augmented reality. It wasn't some opiate that just completely replaced the experiences I was having. I used it to enhance my surroundings rather than escape from them. But I can still appreciate some parts of that obsession may not have been healthy, or at least helpful in the long run. We've all heard it said that nothing done to excess is healthy. I think that's a pedestrian, commentary. I mean, so what some people do to excess is not excessive to other people. Sometimes we need to do things to excess. But I think in the case of escapism, whether it's healthy or not boils down to why we're doing it. As I said before, do we feel compelled to escape when everything's good? Probably not. That said, not everything we do is something that we're fully engaged in or that fulfills us. Sometimes we need to do things that we don't want to do, and sometimes we, console ourselves by doing things afterwards that we really wanted to do. A lot of people still work that way. They live that way. They do a job they do, not because they absolutely love it and it fulfills them, but because they need to work, they need to pay bills, and fortunately, working provides them with the income to pursue their real interests. Why do we pursue fantasy? To console ourselves, to recharge, to engage, bring into play faculties which may lie dormant. Let's face it, we are expected to do a lot of pretty routine things nowadays. We don't get to recruit most of our abilities like, say, we would have as hunter-gatherers. We live what, some sociologists might claim to be pretty artificial lives as far as our evolutionary biology is concerned. I think escapism becomes detrimental or unhealthy when we use it strictly as a haven from reality. Someplace we tuck into, we stay in, like virtual reality. I mean, even though there are interests and pursuits which engage us bodily, I think the idea of escapism and fantasy is more rooted in the imagination, sitting there quietly with a book, with a headset on, eyes closed, headphones, that sort of thing. But when we require it to step out, and when our experiences within that world of imagination begin to set standards that cause us to resent the world from which we are escaping, I think that's when it starts to become unhealthy. It can tell you that the way you are living in reality is unfulfilling. It can remind you like a tap on the shoulder. But the imagination, unlike reality, doesn't have touchstones. One can pursue fantasies in one's own imagination. Fantasies we recognize are unfeasible or impractical in reality, and so they must live within the imagination in the same way a delicate flower like an orchid can exist only in a greenhouse. Although escapism requires imagination, not all imagination is escapism. Imagination, of course, is essential for even the most practical tasks. They need to be planned. They need to be problems need to be anticipated. Imagination is also essential to invention and innovation. Even fantasy. For example, Peter Dickinson, who wrote Flight of Dragons, claimed that all modern technologies had precedence in magic, in something that was imagined possible only through magic, or originally through magic. Self-moving vehicles, flight, speaking to each other over long distances, like say with the Seeing Stones in Lord of the Rings. And it was in hopes of bringing those things into the world, those things they had imagined, that inventors and innovators gradually created the technology that allowed us to do that. And imagination, of course, is essential. And this is why we have to be careful not to group imagination, fantasy, and escapism all into the same thing. Fantasy, according to J.R.R. Tolkien, is essential to what he calls recovery. It gets us out of this tangle of expectations and basically cultural overgrowth that may confuse our minds, our basic thinking, and allows us to get back into a world where it's cleaner, where we can clean our windows. It's almost mythological that way. It gets us back to the bones of an animal that's become so obese we may not see its framework anymore. Escapism has its basis in getting away. And I think fundamentally, what makes escapism dangerous or unhealthy is when the models we escape to start to create resentment toward the world that is in ways that cannot be rectified. Pornography is actually blamed a lot for this because it creates an understanding of women and sex that are unrealistic, that can't be met. And so if somebody escapes or imagines sex and women through pornography, it is going to create resentment towards the actual thing. To get back to Dungeons and Dragons, when people found out in the 80s and 90s that you played D&D, they usually reacted in one of two ways. One, they'd played it before, they knew what it was, and not many people were in this camp. The other was that they thought it was creepy, weird, and possibly satanic. But there are other perspectives. For example, my dad and the dad of a friend both admired the depth of the game. They fully appreciated how complex it was, the rules, its fandom, how fascinating it was. But at the same time, they were wary about getting drawn into it. They basically said, I can't get into that. I think I was around 15 or 16 when I first heard this. And, you know, when you're a teenager and you're full of fire, you're all ready to, talk back at these stigmas, you're militant. But that was the first perspective on the game that kind of, rang the alarm bells that maybe escapism wasn't entirely healthy, that there was there's a healthy caution toward it. You can get drawn into a rabbit hole. You'll get pulled off the beaten path into a world of whimsy, a world of purely impractical imagination and escape that has no regard and even disdain towards, the world above ground. And this wonderland can, as I said before, create standards and hopes and expectations that the real world's touchstones simply cannot validate. And these things can lead to lifelong disappointment if pursued too aggressively in one's formative years. And of course, this is what childhood nostalgia is rooted in. It's this idea that the world of adulthood is mean. All the things that made you happiest as a child that, evaporated in the cold light of maturity. I've turned people into, the comic book guy from The Simpsons, where they're just bitterly disappointed. They want to go back. They want to, crawl back onto their mother's lap. As sad as it is, and as understandable as it is, I think what makes escapism contemptible is that willfully clinging to something we know to be wrong, impractical, useless, detrimental, is contrary to our very survival as a species. We have a remarkable godlike ability to adapt and to master the environment, to take adversity as a teacher and to turn it back, wield it back against the world that hurt us, create civilizations, wall out our opponents. Emotional intelligence is measured by the ability to adapt to a situation and not stagnate and wish and hope for otherwise. It's about striking out. And of course, our most admired heroes are the ones who struck out against adversity. They're not the ones that, sat biting the coals at their home fires. And so as conciliatory as escapism might prove, I think as a term, it is to be viewed with suspicion. We should probably stick to fantasy, imagination, fiction, and those sorts of things. And escapism should be viewed more as an indulgence, because I think when developed systematically, it suggests that we are getting away from a bully, from an arbiter who is just too intimidating to face head on. It's a haven from a storm. Granted, we all need to duck into the havens for repairs and, for some rum, but then you need to tack back out into the storm, because nothing was discovered otherwise and nothing was ever done. So with that, I know I haven't covered a ton of ground. I've done a little bit of a tap dance on a stage a million miles wide. I'd love to hear what anybody else has to think, some considerations, some experiences they've had, whether they think escapism as a term is defensible, whether we should keep it, whether we should avoid it. But I still think it is an aspect of fantasy and fiction that is always in the room, whether it's an elephant or somebody sitting at the table along with you. This has been the Atlas of Elsewhere, and I'm Harley Sims, and I will see you again eventually.